The lecture hall on Prime was filled with students from 12 different species. They sat in curved rows that rose toward the ceiling, and the morning light from 3 distant suns came through the tall windows. Some students had scales, others had feathers, and a few had shells or compound eyes. They came from worlds scattered across the galaxy, and they had come to the Galactic Academy of Relations to learn about each other. Professor stood at the front of the room. He was a tall and thin with silver skin that seemed to glow faintly in the light. He had 4 eyes arranged in a diamond pattern on his face, and all 4 were focused on his students as they settled into their seats. He had taught at this academy for 60 years, and he had studied human history for even longer. Today, he would share something that most of these young beings had never heard. Sitting quietly in the corner was Myra Collins, his human teaching assistant. She was a small woman with brown hair tied back in a simple knot. Her face was calm and her hands rested in her lap. She had been a military medic once, though that was many years ago. Now she helped Professor with his research and graded student papers. Most students barely noticed her. In the third row, a young named clicked her mandibles impatiently. She was, with a hard black shell and 4 arms that she used to tap on her desk. Her species were warriors, and they had fought in 17 galactic conflicts. She considered herself superior to most of the beings in this room. Next to her sat a with green scales and yellow eyes. He was known for asking difficult questions that made professors uncomfortable. He enjoyed learning things that others tried to hide. Behind them both was a with soft blue feathers and a nervous way of looking around the room. Her had nearly been destroyed in the last Great War, and she flinched at loud noises. She had come to the academy hopping to understand how to prevent such destruction from ever happening again. Professor cleared his throat, and the room fell silent. "Today we will discuss the Galactic Warfare Prohibition Act," he said. His voice was soft, but it carried to every corner of the room. "Specifically, we will discuss Article 7. He touched a panel on his desk, and a holographic display appeared in the air. Words glowed in the common galactic script. Article 7 states that humans are permanently banned from participating in any sanctioned military conflict, Professor read aloud. They may not serve as soldiers, advisors, strategists, or support personnel in any war recognized by the Galactic Council. Let out a clicking laugh. "Why would anyone bother banning humans from war?" she asked. "They are one of the youngest species in the galaxy. They only achieved interstellar travel 300 years ago. What threat could they possibly pose?" Several other students murmured in agreement. The beside her tilted his head with interest. Professor did not smile. His 4 eyes moved slowly across the room. "That is exactly what we are here to learn," he said. "Most of you assume that humans were banned because they are weak, primitive, or incapable of competing with more advanced species. You assume the Council was protecting them from themselves." He paused and let the silence grow heavy. "You are wrong." In the corner, Myra Collins shifted slightly in her seat. Her face remained calm, but her fingers pressed together a little more tightly. Professor touched his panel again and a new image appeared. It showed a planet covered in green forests and blue oceans. Mountains rose white with snow along one continent, and small cities dotted the landscape. "This is New Montana," Professor said. It was a human colony world home to 12,000 civilians. Farmers, teachers, engineers, and their families. It was a peaceful place. He touched the panel once more and the image changed. Now the forests were burning. The cities were broken ruins. Dark shapes moved across the land, and the oceans had turned gray with ash. This is what the Thresh did to New Montana in the year 2847 of the common calendar. Made a small sound of distress. She knew about the Thresh. Everyone knew about the Thresh. They were a hive-mind species that consumed worlds, stripping them of all resources and life before moving on. They had been destroyed long ago, but their memory still haunted the galaxy. "The humans sent emergency transmissions to the Galactic Council," Professor continued. "They begged for help. They pleaded for anyone to send ships, weapons, soldiers. They said they could not survive alone." He turned to face his students directly. "The Council voted to abandon them. New Montana was considered a lost cause. Humans were a young species with no powerful allies. The Council decided it was not worth the cost to save them." Leaned forward. "What happened next?" he asked. Professor did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward the corner of the room where Myra sat. She met his gaze for a moment, then looked down at her hands. "What happened next," Professor said slowly, "is why we are having this lecture. What happened next is why Article 7 exists. What happened next changed the way the entire galaxy looks at human beings." He touched his panel and a video began to play. It showed a human man standing on a mountain ridge. He wore torn clothing and his face was covered in dirt and blood. Behind him, fires burned in the valley below. He was speaking into a communication device and his voice was rough but steady. "To any human who can hear this," the man said, "we are not dying here. We are not giving them one more life. From this moment forward, we fight until there is nothing left of us or nothing left of them." The video froze on the man's face. His eyes were not filled with fear. They were filled with something else, something that made stop clicking her mandibles and made hold his breath. Professor let the silence stretch. "That man was Captain Danny," he said. "He had 200 defense personnel and 12,000 civilians against a Thresh invasion force of over 100,000. The Council expected the colony to fall within 3 days." He turned off the display and faced his students. It did not fall, and what humans did to survive, what they became in order to win, is the reason they are now forbidden from ever fighting again. In the corner, Myra Collins quietly stood and walked toward the door. Her hands were shaking slightly, though she tried to hide it. Professor watched her go but said nothing. Looked at the empty doorway, then back at the professor. "What did they do?" she asked. Her voice had lost its mocking tone. Professor began to gather his materials for the next session. "Come back tomorrow," he said, "and I will show you." The students returned the next day with a different feeling in their hearts. No longer sat with her arms crossed in boredom. Had spent the night reading everything he could find about New Montana, but the records were sealed and he found almost nothing. Had not slept well, troubled by dreams of burning worlds. Professor stood at the front of the room once more. The morning light seemed dimmer today, though perhaps that was only their imagination. Myra Collins had returned to her corner seat, and her face was as calm as before. Only her eyes seemed different, deeper somehow, as if she was looking at something far away. "Before we continue," Professor said, "I must tell you that what you will see today is classified material. It has been sealed by the Galactic Council for 200 years. I have special permission to show it for educational purposes, but you must understand that this is not entertainment. Real people lived and died in these recordings." He touched his panel, and the holographic display flickered to life. It showed a man in a military uniform sitting in a small office. He had brown hair cut short and tired lines around his eyes. A nameplate on his desk read Captain Danny. "This is recovered footage from New Montana's defense headquarters," Professor explained. "It was recorded on the first day of the Thresh invasion." In the recording, Captain was speaking to a young woman who stood at attention before him. She had dark hair pulled back tight, and her hands were clenched at her sides. "Lieutenant Martinez," said in a calm voice, "what is the status of our orbital defenses?" "Gone, sir," answered. Her voice cracked slightly. "The Thresh destroyed our satellites in the first wave. We have no communication with the outer colonies and no way to call for help." Nodded slowly. He did not look surprised. "And the civilian population?" "We have moved 6,000 to the mountain shelters. The rest are still in the coastal cities. Sir, the Thresh landing ships are already descending. We have maybe 2 hours before they reach the populated areas." Captain stood up and walked to his window. Outside, the sky was filled with dark shapes falling through the clouds. Each shape was a Thresh drop pod carrying hundreds of the creatures. "How many soldiers do we have?" he asked quietly. 212, sir, and most of them have never seen real combat." The recording flickered and changed to a different scene. Now it showed a great hall filled with alien beings of many species. They sat in a circular chamber with a raised platform in the center. This was the emergency session of the Galactic Council. While Captain was preparing his defenses, Professor narrated, the Council was receiving the human distress calls. A human diplomat appeared on the central platform. She was a middle-aged woman with gray in her hair and fear in her eyes. She held a data tablet that showed the destruction happening on New Montana. "Please," she begged the assembled representatives, "we are asking for any assistance you can provide. Ships, weapons, medical supplies, anything. Our colony will be destroyed within days if we do not receive help." An ancient creature rose from the council seats. He was tall and bent with age, his body covered in golden robes. This was Elder Consul, one of the most powerful voices in galactic politics. "The Council has reviewed your request," said. His voice was cold and formal. "We have determined that a rescue operation for New Montana is not feasible. The Thresh invasion force is too large, and your colony is too far from protected space. The cost of intervention would be too high." The human diplomat's face went pale. "You are abandoning us." "We are making a strategic decision. Your species is young. You have no significant alliances. The resources required to save 12,000 humans could be used to protect millions of Council citizens elsewhere. The mathematics are clear." "Mathematics," the diplomat's voice rose. "These are people, families, children." Expression did not change. "The Council has voted. Your request is, we suggest you begin evacuation procedures, though we recognize this may not be possible given the circumstances. The Council expresses its condolences for your loss." The recording ended, and Professor paused it. In the lecture hall had covered her face with her wings. Scales had darkened with anger, even sat very still. "The Council left them to die," said. "It was not a question." "Yes," Professor confirmed. "They calculated the value of human lives against the cost of intervention and decided humans were not worth saving." He started another recording. This one showed Captain receiving the Council's decision on a small screen in his office. Martinez stood beside him, and her face was wet with tears. "Sir," she said, "maybe we should consider surrender. The Thresh sometimes take prisoners. Maybe they would spare the civilians if we offered ourselves." Turned to look at her. His face was not angry, but there was something in his eyes that made take a step backward. "The Thresh do not take prisoners, Lieutenant. They have never taken prisoners. They consume everything they find and move on to the next world. Surrender means death, just slower and more painful." He stood up and walked to a communication panel on the wall. "Sir, what are you doing?" "The Council has abandoned us. No one is coming to help. That means we have two choices. We can lie down and die, or we can fight." Shook her head. "Fight, with 200 soldiers against 100,000 Thresh. That is not fighting, sir. That is suicide." Danny activated the colony-wide broadcast system. His voice would reach every shelter, every hiding place, every corner of New Montana where humans still drew breath. "This is Captain Danny," he said into the system. "I'm speaking to every human who can hear my voice. The Galactic Council has refused to help us. They have decided that our lives are not worth saving. They expect us to die quietly and quickly so they do not have to think about us anymore." He paused and took a slow breath. "I have a different idea. We are not going to die quietly. We are not going to make this easy for the Thresh or for the Council that abandoned us. Every one of us who can hold a weapon will hold a weapon. Every one of us who can run will help others escape. Every one of us will fight until our last breath." His voice grew stronger. "To any human who can hear this, we are not dying here. We are not giving them one more life. From this moment forward, we fight until there is nothing left of us or nothing left of them." The recording ended. In the present, Myra Collins had closed her eyes. Her hands were folded in her lap, but her knuckles were white. Professor turned to his students. That broadcast was heard by every survivor on New Montana. Within 6 hours, civilians who had never touched a weapon were arming themselves with mining tools, farming equipment, and anything else that could cause harm. Within 12 hours, the first organized resistance attacks began in the mountains. He paused. The Council expected the colony to fall in 3 days. They sent observers after 1 week to document the extinction of New Montana's population. "What did the observers find?" asked. Her voice was very quiet. Professor looked at her with all 4 of his silver eyes. "They found the Thresh retreating." The lecture hall was completely silent as Professor prepared the next set of recordings. No student whispered to their neighbor. No one shifted in their seats. They waited with the kind of attention that comes only when you realize you are about to learn something that will change the way you see the universe. "The Thresh had conquered 47 worlds before they came to New Montana," Professor began. "They had never failed to take a planet. Their hive mind allowed them to coordinate millions of units with perfect efficiency. They felt no fear, no hesitation, no mercy. They were considered the most dangerous species in the known galaxy." He activated a holographic map showing the terrain of New Montana. Mountain ranges stretched across the northern continent, covered in thick forests and riddled with caves. Captain moved the survivors into these mountains. The terrain was too difficult for the Thresh's heavy assault units. The forests blocked their aerial surveillance, and the cave systems provided shelter that could not be easily destroyed. A new recording began. It showed a group of humans huddled in a dark cave, their faces lit by small portable lights. Among them was a young man with hollow eyes and a jaw set hard with grief. A nameplate on his torn uniform read Corporal Ben Tanner. Corporal Tanner had lost his entire family in the initial attack, Professor explained. His parents, his wife, and his two young children were killed when the Thresh destroyed the coastal city of Haven Bay. By all psychological standards, he should have been broken beyond function. In the recording, Ben Tanner was assembling a weapon from mining equipment. His hands moved with cold precision, attaching a power cell to a modified drilling laser. "I do not care about surviving," he said to someone off camera. "I care about making them pay. Every single one I kill is a payment on the debt they owe my family, and the debt is very, very large." The recording shifted to show a night attack. The darkness was broken by flashes of light as humans emerged from the forest and struck a Thresh patrol. The creatures were fast and deadly, but the humans moved with a kind of desperate fury that seemed to catch them off guard. Ben Tanner led the charge. He did not scream or shout. He simply moved through the Thresh ranks with his improvised weapon, cutting them down one after another. When his weapon overheated and failed, he picked up a Thresh limb and used it as a club until the patrol was destroyed. Professor paused the recording. This kind of behavior confused the Thresh hive mind. They had fought many species, but all of those species followed logical patterns. When losses reached a certain percentage, enemies would retreat. When victory became impossible, enemies would surrender. The mathematics of survival demanded these responses. He looked at his students with grave eyes. Humans did not follow these patterns. They attacked when they should have retreated. They fought when surrender would have saved their lives. They showed no interest in their own survival, only in causing as much damage as possible to the enemy. Raised his hand. "Professor, surely some humans tried to surrender. Not everyone could have shared this desire to fight." "A reasonable question," Professor nodded. "And yes, in the first week, there were humans who attempted to surrender to the Thresh. They walked out of the forests with their hands raised, hopping for mercy." He started another recording. It showed a group of humans, mostly elderly and very young, approaching a Thresh formation. They were waving white cloth and calling out that they gave up. The Thresh consumed them. Not quickly, not mercifully, but slowly and deliberately, while the hidden human observers watched from the trees. "After that," Professor said quietly, "no human ever attempted surrender again. Captain made sure every survivor saw what happened to those who gave up. He wanted them to understand that there was no choice but to fight." The next recordings showed months of warfare compressed into minutes. Humans learned to use the terrain, setting traps and ambushes that killed hundreds of Thresh at a time. They discovered that Thresh communication relied on pheromone signals, and they began capturing Thresh units and harvesting those pheromones. Ben Tanner led a raid that changed the course of the war, Professor narrated. He captured a wounded Thresh coordinator and brought it back to the human camps alive. For 3 days, the human scientists studied its biology while it remained conscious. They learned how the pheromone system worked. The recording showed humans coating themselves in Thresh pheromones and walking directly into enemy formations. The Thresh units became confused, unable to distinguish friend from enemy. In the chaos, humans detonated explosive devices that killed thousands. The Thresh had never encountered biological warfare used against their own communication system, Professor said. They did not know how to adapt. Every time they developed a countermeasure, the humans found a new weakness to exploit. Leaned forward, her warrior instincts recognized what she was seeing. "They were not just fighting," she said slowly. "They were learning. Every battle taught them something new about the enemy. They were becoming more dangerous every day." "Precisely," Professor confirmed. "And this is where the true horror began for the Thresh hive mind." He showed a recording of a Thresh command structure, a massive organic brain suspended in a cavern beneath the planet's surface. This was the central consciousness that controlled the entire invasion force. "That had existed for 10,000 years," Professor explained. It had consumed countless worlds and defeated countless enemies. It had never known fear because it had never encountered anything it could not predict and overcome. The recording showed the pulsing with activity as it processed data from the surface. Tentacles of flesh connected it to thousands of information nodes, and its thoughts were visible as patterns of light flowing through its tissue. For the first time in its existence, Professor said, the experienced something it could not understand. The humans should have been extinct by now. They had lost 80% of their population. They had no supplies coming, no reinforcements, no hope of rescue. By every calculation, they should have stopped fighting weeks ago. The patterns became erratic, confused. The humans did not stop. They kept attacking. They kept dying. And they kept coming back. They could not calculate why. It could not predict their behavior. And for a being that had controlled entire worlds through perfect prediction, this was terrifying. Professor showed the final battle. Captain stood on a ridge overlooking the Thresh landing ships. Behind him were 47 survivors out of the original 12,000. They were wounded, starving, barely able to stand. Martinez stood beside him. Her arm was wrapped in bloody bandages, and her face was thin from hunger. "Sir," she said, "we cannot win this. There are still thousands of them between us and those ships." Looked at her. His eyes held no hope, but also no despair. There was only a cold determination that seemed to come from somewhere beyond normal human emotion. "We are not trying to win, Lieutenant. We are trying to make them leave. And the only way to do that is to show them that we will never stop, that no matter how many of us they kill, the survivors will keep fighting, that this planet will cost them more than it could ever be worth." He raised his weapon and started walking toward the Thresh lines. The other 46 survivors followed him. They did not run. They did not scream. They simply walked forward with their weapons ready, knowing most of them would die. The recording captured what happened next. The humans advanced into the Thresh formation and began killing. The Thresh killed many of them in return, but for every human that fell, 2 more kept moving forward. Then this voice echoed across the battlefield. It was a sound that no one had ever heard before, a transmission in the common galactic language. "Disengage, leave this world. These creatures do not surrender. These creatures do not stop. We cannot calculate their behavior. We cannot win." The Thresh began to retreat. Landing ships lifted off from the surface, abandoning equipment and captured resources. Within 6 hours, every Thresh unit had left New Montana. Professor stopped the recording. 12,000 humans faced 100,000 Thresh. 47 humans survived, but the Thresh fled, and they never returned to human space again. In the lecture hall, no one spoke for a very long time. Feathers trembled. "They won," she whispered. "They actually won." "Yes," Professor said quietly. "They won. But the Council was watching, and what they saw frightened them more than the Thresh ever had." News of New Montana spread across the galaxy within days. The Thresh had been driven from a world by a species that most Council members had never bothered to learn about. Emergency meetings were called. Intelligence reports were demanded. And for the first time, the great powers of the galaxy turned their attention to the small blue and green worlds where humans lived. Professor showed his students a recording of the Emergency Council Summit that took place 2 weeks after the Thresh retreat. The great circular chamber was filled with representatives from every major species. The air hummed with tension and whispered conversations. "The Council summoned human leadership to explain what had happened," Professor narrated. "They expected a simple debriefing from a grateful species that had barely survived extinction. What they got was something very different." A human woman walked onto the central platform. She was tall and straight-backed, with gray hair pulled into a neat arrangement and eyes that held no warmth. Her name was Ambassador Grace Porter, and she was the first human to ever address the full Galactic Council. She stood in silence for a long moment, looking around at the assembled representatives. Many of them would not meet her gaze. "I am here," she finally said, "because you summoned me, not because I believe you deserve an explanation." Murmurs rippled through the chamber. Elder Consul, who had voted to abandon New Montana, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "6 months ago, we begged you for help," Ambassador Porter continued. "We offered everything we had in exchange for even the smallest assistance. Ships, resources, political concessions. We were willing to pay any price to save our people." Her voice grew harder. "You told us we were not worth saving. You calculated the value of 12,000 human lives and decided we were expendable. You left us to die." She pulled out a data tablet and held it up. "This is the casualty report from New Montana. 11,953 humans died defending that colony. Men, women, and children, farmers and teachers and engineers. They died because you would not send help." The chamber was completely silent. "But 47 of us survived," Ambassador Porter said. "And we did not survive because of luck or divine intervention. We survived because we refused to accept the death you planned for us. We survived because human beings do not lie down and die when someone tells us we should." High Chancellor rose from his elevated seat. He was the oldest member of the council, a being of immense political power whose species had ruled the galaxy for. His body was wrapped in ceremonial robes, and his ancient eyes studied the human woman with careful attention. "Ambassador Porter," he said in a measured voice, "the council did not summon you here to receive complaints about past decisions. We summoned you to understand what happened on New Montana. Our observers reported events that do not match any known behavioral patterns." "You want to understand why we fought instead of dying quietly," Ambassador Porter said. "It was not a question. We want to understand how you defeated the Thresh with 200 soldiers against 100,000. We want to understand why your people continued fighting when all hope of survival was gone. We want to understand what kind of species does these things." Admiral of the stood up from his seat. He was a massive creature covered in natural armor, and his species had been the most feared warriors in the galaxy before the Thresh appeared. "I have reviewed the battle recordings," Admiral said. "What I saw was remarkable. The humans fought with a ferocity that rivals our finest soldiers. I propose that we immediately begin recruiting humans as shock troops for Council military operations. With proper training and equipment, they could be invaluable assets." Ambassador Porter turned to look at him. "You want to use us as weapons. I want to recognize your potential. Your species has proven itself capable of extraordinary violence. That capability should be directed toward the protection of Council interests." High Chancellor raised a hand to silence the Admiral. "Before we discuss such proposals, we must understand what we are dealing with." He turned to a side door. "Bring in the survivor." The door opened, and Captain Danny walked slowly into the chamber. He was a changed man from the recordings they had seen. His hair had turned gray, his face was lined with deep creases, and his eyes held the kind of emptiness that comes from seeing too much death. He walked with a slight limp, and his hands trembled slightly as he stood before the council. "Captain," High Chancellor said, "you led the defense of New Montana. You commanded forces that achieved what our military analysts consider impossible. I have one question for you." Looked up at the ancient Chancellor. His expression did not change. "Why did you not surrender?" For a long moment said nothing. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough and quiet. "They hurt my people." The Chancellor waited for more, but offered nothing else. "That is not a strategic reason," Elder Consul interrupted. "Surrender would have ended the conflict. Some of your people might have survived as prisoners. Instead, you chose to fight a hopeless battle that killed almost everyone." Turned his empty eyes toward. "The Thresh do not take prisoners. You knew that when you abandoned us. You sentenced us to death and expected us to accept it. We expected you to behave rationally, to calculate your odds and make logical decisions about survival." "Rational?" repeated the word as if it tasted strange. "You want to know why humans do not surrender? Because we cannot. When someone threatens our families, our homes, everything we love, we do not calculate odds. We do not weigh costs and benefits. Something inside us changes. We become something else." He looked around the great chamber at all the alien faces watching him. "Every species in this room has limits. You fight until the cost becomes too high and then you stop. You retreat or surrender or negotiate. That is rational. That is logical." His voice dropped lower. "Humans do not have that limit. When we are pushed far enough, when we lose enough, we stop caring about survival. The only thing that matters is making the enemy pay. We will burn ourselves to ashes if we can take our enemies with us. We will destroy everything we have if it means destroying those who hurt us." Admiral leaned forward with interest. "This is exactly why we should recruit them. That kind of determination is invaluable in warfare." High Chancellor held up his hand again. His ancient eyes were fixed on Captain. "And if the Council became your enemy," he asked quietly, If we threatened your people or your worlds, would you fight us with the same fury you showed the Thresh? Met his gaze. You already know the answer to that. The chamber erupted in worried murmurs. Representatives whispered to each other, and many looked at the human woman and man standing before them with new expressions on their faces. Not contempt, not dismissal, fear. High Chancellor called for order, and the noise slowly faded. I propose that we vote on Article 7 of the Galactic Warfare Prohibition Act, he announced. This article will permanently ban humans from participating in any sanctioned military conflict. They may not serve as soldiers, advisors, strategists, or support personnel in any war recognized by this council. Admiral rose angrily. You want to ban them? They are the most effective warriors we have ever seen. This is foolishness. It is survival, replied. I have studied the recordings from New Montana very carefully. I have consulted with our finest psychologists and military strategists. They all reached the same conclusion. He looked directly at Captain. Humans do not fight like other species. They do not calculate acceptable losses. They do not know when to stop. If we allow them to participate in our wars, we risk creating an enemy that will never accept defeat. And if they ever turn that fury against us, we will face the same fate as the Thresh. The vote was held. It was unanimous. Article 7 passed without a single voice of opposition. Ambassador Porter stood rigid on the platform. And if we refuse to accept this ban? High Chancellor looked at her with something almost like sadness. Then you will have proven us correct to fear you. The lecture hall felt different after 4 days of recordings and revelations. The students who had walked in at the beginning of the week were not the same beings who sat in their seats now. No longer boasted about her warrior heritage. Had stopped asking clever questions designed to challenge his professors. Had found a strange kind of peace in understanding that even the most devastating wars could end. Professor stood at his usual place, but he too seemed changed. His silver skin had lost some of its glow, and his 4 eyes moved more slowly across the room. Teaching this material always cost him something. We have reached the end of our examination of Article 7, he said. You now understand the historical events that led to the ban on human military participation. You understand what happened on New Montana and how the Council responded. He paused and looked toward the corner where Myra Collins sat. But there is one more piece of this story that I believe you need to hear. It comes not from official records or classified files. It comes from someone who was there. Myra looked up. Her calm expression flickered for just a moment. When the Council medical ships finally arrived at New Montana, Professor continued, they found 47 survivors in critical condition. Most were suffering from wounds, starvation, and severe psychological trauma. Among the medical personnel who responded to that call was a young human medic named Myra Collins. Every student turned to look at the quiet woman in the corner. Myra stood slowly. Her hands were steady now, and her voice was clear when she spoke. I served on the medical frigate Hope's Promise, she said. We were the first responders after the Thresh retreat. What we found on that planet was beyond anything I had seen in my training. She walked forward to stand beside Professor. The survivors were not grateful to be alive. They did not celebrate their victory. Most of them could barely speak. They had spent 6 months becoming something other than human in order to survive, and they did not know how to become human again. Her eyes grew distant with memory. Captain Danny was the worst. His wounds were treatable, but his mind had gone somewhere very far away. He spent the first week aboard our ship staring at the walls and refusing to eat. When he finally started speaking, he only talked about the people he had lost, not the ones he had saved, the ones he had lost. Raised her hand hesitantly. What happened to him? I stayed with him for 3 years, Myra answered. The Council paid for the best psychological treatment available. They were not being kind. They were afraid of what he might do if they let him return to human space without supervision. She took a breath. He improved slowly. He started eating again, then walking, then talking about things other than New Montana. But he never fully recovered. The person he had been before the invasion was gone. In his place was someone who understood exactly what humans were capable of, and that knowledge haunted him. Professor nodded. This is why I invited you here today, Myra, because I believe these students need to understand the cost of what happened on New Montana, not just the deaths, but the damage done to those who survived. Myra looked at the young aliens in their seats, children from worlds she had never visited and species she had spent years learning to understand. Captain died 3 years after the battle, she said. I was holding his hand when he passed. In his final hours, he was lucid for the first time in months. He knew where he was and what was happening, and he wanted to tell me something. The room was absolutely still. He said that he did not regret fighting. He did not regret refusing to surrender. He regretted what he had become in order to win. He said that something inside him had broken during those 6 months, something that could never be repaired, and he was afraid that other humans would have to break the same way if the ban was ever lifted. She paused. He told me that the galaxy was right to fear what humans can do. He said that he feared it too, and he asked me to make sure that his story was told honestly so that future generations would understand why the ban matters. A door at the back of the lecture hall opened. A man walked in, tall and straight with brown hair and the same strong jaw that the students had seen in the recordings of Captain. But this man's eyes were warm, and he smiled as he approached the front of the room. This is Ambassador Danny, Professor announced. He is the son of Captain and now serves as one of humanity's senior representatives to the Galactic Council. Ambassador took his place beside Myra. He nodded to her with obvious respect, then turned to face the students. My father died before I was born, he said. I never knew him except through stories and recordings, but I have spent my entire life trying to understand what he went through and why he made the choices he made. He clasped his hands behind his back. Many humans believe that Article 7 is an insult. They think the galaxy fears us because we are strong and that we should take pride in that fear. They want the ban lifted so that we can prove ourselves as warriors. His expression grew serious. I disagree, and I believe my father would disagree too. Leaned forward. Why would you accept a ban that treats your species as dangerous animals? Because we are dangerous, Ambassador replied simply. Not because we are evil or cruel, but because we love too deeply. When something threatens the people and places we care about, we become capable of things that frighten even us. My father proved that on New Montana. He won a war that should have been impossible, but the cost of that victory was his own humanity. He looked around the room at each student in turn. The greatest strength of human beings is not our capacity for violence. It is our capacity to choose. We can choose to fight or to make peace. We can choose to destroy or to build. We can choose to become monsters or to remain human. He gestured toward Myra. My father chose to fight because he had no other option. But afterward, he chose to support the ban because he understood something important. Having the power to win does not mean you should use that power. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is put down your weapons and walk away. Ambassador smiled gently. Humans accepted Article 7 not because we were forced to, but because we chose to. We chose to let the galaxy see us as something other than warriors. We chose to build relationships based on trade and culture and cooperation instead of fear. We chose to be more than what we became on New Montana. Professor nodded slowly. And that is the lesson I hope you will take from this week. Power is not the same as wisdom. The ability to destroy is not the same as strength. And the species that truly deserve respect are not the ones who fight the hardest, but the ones who know when not to fight at all. The lecture ended, and students began to gather their belongings. Many lingered, speaking quietly with each other about what they had learned. Several approached Ambassador to ask questions or simply to shake his hand. Remained in her seat long after the others had left. Her mandibles clicked softly as she processed everything she had heard. Finally, she stood and walked to where Myra was preparing to leave. "May I ask you something?" said. Myra turned to face her. "Of course. My people have built our entire civilization around warfare and honor in battle. I was raised to believe that strength is the only thing that matters, and that those who can fight should always fight." She paused, struggling to find the right words. "What you have shown me this week has challenged everything I thought I knew. Humans are stronger than you proved that on New Montana, but you choose not to use that strength. You choose peace when you could choose war." Myra listened patiently. "What does it feel like?" asked, "to have that much fury inside you and choose not to use it?" Myra was quiet for a long moment. When she finally answered, her voice was soft but steady. "It feels like being human." Considered this answer. Then slowly, She lowered her head in a gesture of respect that her species reserved only for worthy opponents. "I think," she said, "that I have much to learn." Myra reached out and placed a gentle hand on this armored shoulder. "We all do," she said. "That is why we are here." Outside the academy windows, 3 suns were setting over Prime. Their light painted the sky in shades of gold and purple and deep blue. Somewhere among those distant stars, human worlds turned peacefully through space, their people living lives of work and love and ordinary struggle. They were not warriors, they were not weapons, they were simply human with all the terrible beauty that word contained. And that was enough.